I'm setting up to bleed the brakes, and I just adjusted the rear drum screws so that they are spinning freely with no dragging. If I put the screw in another half click, it would start dragging. So I went all the way to where it started dragging a little and then backed one off. So that's what I did first. And since this is a 1976 with the 1500 engine, it's got 2 lines coming out of the brake reservoir, which means it's a dual circuit system. And so then my manual tells me you need to do the right side of the car at the same time first because it's furthest away from the cylinder, and then the left side. So that's what I'm going to do. So I've got both bleed screws cracked, running into a bottle with the end submerged. This is the one up in the front. So all I did was crack them so far. Let's see if you can see. There's already air bubbles coming out just statically. So there might be a lot of air in this system. The other thing is the manual says replace it every 24 months because this is DOT3 fluid, which is attracts moisture from the atmosphere in general. So this needs to be flushed anyways. The color in the reservoir is much darker than this fresh fluid I have down here. So maybe I'll just flush the whole system. Alright, I got my lovely assistant here. It's really cold, so I promised her only 3 minutes at a time. But she's pressing the brake pedal. I'm watching the fluid level to make sure this never goes too low. And I'm watching the fluid move through the lines. So that only seemed to cycle this front portion of the reservoir. You can see the color difference. This is new fluid, this is the old fluid. And then you can see we moved a lot of fluid through the front. You can see the color difference there. So a lot of fluid got moved through the front, and not so much got moved through the rear, a lot less through here. I'm wondering if that's because it's further away. But what's also interesting is, you see that black floating scuzz? That was like one big glob that came out all at once. So maybe the rear was clogged and that's why the braking was pretty bad. But I'm going to go with this for now, say this side is bled. If it still doesn't feel great, I'll bring it back in for a rebleed and I'll keep the front closed and just bleed the rear. Maybe that's the problem, is the front is closer, so when I'm stroking the pedal, it follows the path of least resistance, so the old fluid goes out the front more than the rear. We'll see. And now step 2, I've got them set up on the left side of the car, so we'll bleed the left side. Alright, first bleed on this side. You can see this nasty black fluid coming out right away on the rear. So I just screwed up and broke rule number 1 of bleeding brakes. I let the reservoir run dry. I was watching the rear brake back there and it was coming out really slowly, but I didn't know that the front was coming out much more quickly, and this actually emptied. So actually I think this front portion is for the front brakes and rear is for the rear. So what I'm going to do now is I have to bleed all the air out of the system. This might be a blessing in disguise because now I know I'm going to get all the old fluid out and all the air out. I'm going to go back to the right side and just do the rear first, then the front, then the rear, then the front. And now I'm using one of these manual hand vacuum pumps, starting at the rear. What's annoying is the rear is 3/16 bleed nipples and the front is 1/4 inch. So this is actually a 1/4 to 1/4 adapter, and this is 3/16 hose that I just jammed on the 1/4. And now with just doing the rear brake, this rear reservoir is finally starting to drain. So I think this process is working. Okay, so update. I would say do not use one of these. The issue I'm having is, since I'm pulling vacuum and sucking through this line, when I go to crack the bleed screw, air is coming in through the bleed screw threads and then back out through there. So I was having like never-ending air bubbles, and it was impossible to tell, is the air coming from the brake fluid in the brake line, or is it coming through that bleed screw? So I went through a whole bottle of brake fluid and was still getting bubbles. So I'm abandoning this, and I'm going to go back to the manual method. If you're going to use a power brake bleeder, I would suggest using one that actually hooks up to the reservoir up here that hooks up to the reservoir here and forces fluid down through the reservoir up here. You would not have that problem that way. So I would either use one of those or do the manual method. I'm back to the manual method. So after bleeding the brakes, I went for a drive, and they're just like they were before. So I'm thinking there's still air in the system, and when I was manually bleeding, somehow like the air pocket was moving back and forth and never really getting out of one of the bleed valves. So I went and bought this style brake bleeder that applies pressure to the master cylinder reservoir and forces it through the system. So I'm going to try that first and see if I can get an air pocket out. If not, I also noticed that when I just press on the pedal, it slowly goes all the way to the floor. So I'm thinking it might be just a master cylinder problem. And so I bought a replacement master cylinder if I need to get to that. So this brake bleeder comes with all sorts of caps with fittings already on them. None of them are anywhere close to the size of the cap on this MG Midget car. So what I did was I screwed one out and went ahead and threaded into my cap here. That didn't work because there's this like blow-off valve, and anytime I apply pressure, it comes straight out of there. So I have to plug that out. And also I tried to thread, because this is a threaded fitting, I tried to thread it into the cap, and it immediately cracked. I mean, 50-year-old plastic, I'm not surprised. So I'm going to try a better fitting that's more of a pass-through, and then I'm also going to try to plug this up and see if I can get that to work. So to plug off this little vent hole, first I've got this little rubber stopper. If that doesn't work, I'll try a cork next. And to get a good seal around this hole, I'm going to put this on the inside. This is going to become a through hole that will fit right over there. And then I'll have a gasket on either side of the cap. And then if needed, I'll put a nut on, and then this fitting, or just the fitting straight on if that can crush, if that can thread enough in and crush the rubber washer like that and get a good seal. So we'll try that. And I kid you not, I had to go to the hardware store 4 times before I got all these parts right. Turns out these fittings, there's like 5 different kinds, and my brake bleeder has industrial high flow, which is kind of this V-shaped groove, not a ball groove on there, and so that was kind of a nightmare to figure all that out. So hopefully this works and I don't have to go back again. So I got the fitting all put together, and another crack appeared when I tightened the cap, and like you could visibly see in. So since I'm just going to put the new master cylinder anyways, because I need a new cap now, I might as well use the cap from this, and I'll just drill the through hole, and I will make sure that no cracks happen. Also, this is a little too long, so I'll cut this down on a lathe. This was actually hitting the divider between the front and rear portions. And so that way I will just put in a new master cylinder, bleed out all the brakes, get all the air through, and hopefully be done with this once and for all. I got the lathe running, and I'm going to start cutting down the part of the fitting I don't need. It's off. So I cut off the big threaded portion, so now nothing's going to stick down below it onto the divider. This top part will still pass through the cap. I'm taking the old master cylinder out, and this bolt is just a nightmare to get out. There's no access because I'm blocked here and here and here, and then the other side is up in this corner and I can't get a socket on it. This is really frustrating. So here's my winning solution. I've got a socket on to the bolt head with a 1/4 inch impact drive socket and a 1/4 inch wrench on that hex so I can actually hold it. And then over here, I'm turning like 1/32 at a time, and I'll slowly get it out. This is terrible. I've never seen anything this bad. And the master cylinder is out. My lines are still full of brake fluid. But as long as I don't move them around too much, they won't leak at all. But I got these towels in place. I've got the new master cylinder in. And thankfully on the aftermarket one, they have these cutouts, and that gave a lot more clearance to both of these bolts to get to. So now I've got this set up for a bench bleed. So my brake lines are still disconnected, but I'm running these clear plastic hoses to make sure that I get all the air out of the cylinder first. Then I'll put the brake lines in really quick and then bleed the whole system. And so I'm just cycling the brake pedal as I watch this and make sure there's no more air bubbles coming through the tubes. So my last iteration of this cap didn't quite work. Air was leaking up here. So now I gave it the I'm not asking anymore treatment and just siliconed all over it. So we'll see if it will seal. So I couldn't get it to hold pressure. So I sprayed soapy water all over the bottom, no bubbles. And then I sprayed here. So the actual thing itself is leaking. So I'll probably have to return that and get a new one. And already, without even fully bleeding it yet, I just went to go press the pedal, and it's nice and firm. It does not drop to the floor like it did before. So it looks like the problem all along was the master cylinder. And I was just checking in the book again on the master cylinder section to see if I missed anything. And I see a handwritten note pointing to the dimensions of like a washer in here. So I'm guessing what happened is someone tried to rebuild this on their own, make their own washer, and they screwed it up, and that's why the master cylinder wasn't working. So sometimes old cars like this are kind of a crime scene, and you gotta find the clues to what actually happened. I wish I would have seen this a lot earlier and not wasted my time with bleeding initially and just gone straight for the master cylinder. So I just went for a drive, ran a few errands to see how the brakes feel, and it is so much better. The car is actually usable now. I haven't fully bled the system after swapping the master cylinder, but it feels fine to me for now. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Now the next sub-project is if I'm bleeding the brakes so that I can go on the highway. On my highway test, I might as well know how fast I can go. So the speedometer is next. So this is the speedometer from the dash. I got the car. There was no cable plugged into the back of it. So first is, I don't even know if this speedometer works. So now I'm under the car, and this is where the speedometer cable is supposed to come out. So there's no cable in here at all. And then when I feel up in here, there's supposed to be like a speedometer little nylon gear. There's no gear in there at all. If I feel inside, I can feel the gear that's on the actual transmission shaft, but nothing else is there. Not the seal, not the little fork that holds it into place, not the bolts. And I'm thinking there's probably a reason why the cable's not there and the speedometer gear is not there. It might be because that gear got chewed up and broken, and then it wasn't ever reading to the speedometer itself, and no one ever put one back in. It could be because the actual gear that's on the shaft inside the gearbox is damaged, and that's what damaged that. So before I go spending hundreds of dollars in parts to try and track this down, I'm gonna go with a easier, simpler, cheaper solution. And another issue is I have no idea. There's like 3 different tooth counts you can get to go in there, so I have no idea what's supposed to go in there. And so before I buy a gear, a retaining fork, the fork you can't even find in the US, that'll have to be shipped from the UK, a speedometer cable, and maybe even I'd have to buy a whole nother one of these units if this doesn't work. I'm going to look at another solution. Alright, here's my solution I've come up with. I bought this $40, it's actually a GPS speedometer on Amazon. So this GPS mounts on the dash somewhere where GPS can be picked up through a window or something, not under the hood, it wouldn't work. And then this just gives you a readout. It's got a trip meter and an odometer on it too, so I can see how many EV miles I've driven. And the cool part is when this shuts off, this doesn't reset. So I've just got 12-volt power going to it. I can have this yellow switched to the headlights so that when the headlights are on, you can see it lights up. I drove around with it in a car, and it shows about 10% faster than it actually is. So when it says 66, you're really going about 60. And it showing 10% fast is honestly good, because that way I won't speed. If I read this and it says I'm going 60, really only going 55. So I'm okay with that. I'd rather have that than the other way around. When I touch this blue wire to ground after a few minutes, it resets the upper trip meter. So I can just set this on a switch to ground. I can just flick that switch whenever I want to reset the trip meter. The bottom's the odometer, which reads even after it shuts off. Here, I'll show you. I'll shut it off right now. Taking the negative off. It's off. Powered it back on. 2 miles. It didn't reset to 0. This is a lot of functionality for a $40 gauge. I'm pretty happy with this. This is way better than fiddling around with all the speedometer gears and maybe never even getting a solution out of that after spending $100 to $200. And you're probably thinking, this is pretty small. Yeah, you're right. They do make larger ones of these, but I'll show you in a second why a larger one won't work. And so in my dash, I've got these large slots and small slots. This is a small gauge. This is 52 millimeter. This is 52 millimeter. They make a larger version that's 85 millimeter, but this is only 80 millimeter. So I would have to like precisely make this larger. I decided to just go with the small one because that's easier. It's good enough. And I think most of you know you can't really buy these anywhere, and all the MG purists I know would probably come over here and kill me if they knew that I cut a dash to make it a little bit bigger. So that's why I went with that. And there it is. Fits perfectly snug. And it's got this nice easy threaded nut mechanism. I'll run this power through the firewall, and then the GPS sensor I'll probably route around here and place here right on top of the dash by the window. Next mini project is the sticking throttle. So I just pressed the gas pedal inside, and you can see this is stuck in place right now. It didn't return all the way. It needs to return all the way and close this micro switch, otherwise it keeps power active. So my first attempt at a solution is I bought 2 springs from Ace Hardware. They're like $1 each. Now I'm going to stick it around this bolt between here and here, so that it would want to force it all the way back. So let's see how that works. So I installed this spring, and now I feel like a total idiot because this is a complete failure. It buckles. Watch this. Okay, so I scratched the whole spring idea, and all I did was, instead of the screw used to be over in this hole to the right, I just moved it off to the left. That effectively shortened the cable and allowed it to fully return. And then I also verified that when I step on the pedal all the way, I'm getting full 5 kilo ohm out of here. So I know I'm getting the full travel. And I just cycled this like 100 times and it didn't stick at all. So this is what I'm going to go with for now as a temporary fix. But honestly, I think everyone here knows what temporary fix means. It's permanent. Next micro project is at the end of the 30-mile drive. I could feel the motor casing was a little hot to the touch. You see these 2 wires right here. This is like a temperature sensor. If the motor gets too hot, you should wire this up to something to cut power. But everything I've read is by the time this switch actually trips, your motor's too hot anyways. So I wanted to get some sort of temp sensor. And so I bought this off Amazon. It's a little probe here. I'm probably going to epoxy that to the motor casing. And right now I'm just running 12-volt power to it off of a little aux battery. And it reads the temperature in Celsius. You can see right at the red is 60. This is actually pretty well dialed to what I'd want. I think 60C is when I'd probably want to start giving the motor a break. And so it's quite cold out, so I think this is reading accurately, 0.9C. Now when I touch it, You can see it's starting to rise up. So this thing was 10 bucks. This will be another good thing to have monitoring. Make sure I don't burn out my motor. And the other cool thing is this almost fits perfectly in this former switch on the dash. Sideways, as long as I'm okay reading it. Running this way, or I guess the other way? Yeah, that might make a little more sense. The hotter it gets, the higher it goes. I'd have to slightly modify that opening and that'll snap right in. So I've glued that temp sensor probe down there to the side of the motor housing, and it's running through the firewall to the dash. And then these here, I just stacked them on another 5 amp fused section. And I also wanted to see how this temp gauge worked. So it's about 3 or 4 C out today. It's after running 5 to 6 miles of city driving, it got up to 18 C. So that's good that I have this monitoring now, so I know that I won't be getting my motor too hot. So now that the brakes are good, I have temperature monitoring and a speedometer. Next thing is I'm gonna get some of this wiring working. So I got headlights, brake lights, turn signals. Then I will put the whole dash back in and go for a ride on the highway to see what the top speed is and what the highway efficiency is.